In the heart of Oakwood Park, 16-year-old Elijah sat quietly on a bench, watching the leaves rustle gently in the cool breeze. The warmth of the sun embraced him as he waited for his mother, lost in his thoughts. He had come to the park to enjoy a peaceful afternoon, unaware that this seemingly simple moment would soon be shattered. Across the park, a middle-aged white woman, Karen, sat on a bench with her eyes fixed on Elijah. His calm demeanor seemed to irritate her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her eyes narrowed as she observed him, her mind quickly drawing conclusions. Without a second thought, she stood up and walked toward him with purpose, her steps quick and deliberate. "What are you doing here?" Karen demanded sharply, her voice carrying across the park. Elijah was taken aback by her accusatory tone, his confusion rising. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not causing any trouble." But Karen's mind was made up. She didn't believe him. With a cold expression, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "There's a young man here, and I don't know what he's up to," she said urgently into the phone. "He's acting suspicious. I think he's causing trouble." Elijah's heart sank. He hadn't done anything wrong, he was just waiting for his mother. Yet here he was, being unjustly painted as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. His thoughts raced, wondering how this could escalate. His mother had always told him to stay calm during encounters like this, but he couldn't help the rising anxiety in his chest. The police would be here soon, and he knew too well how quickly such situations could spiral out of control. The sound of sirens grew louder, and within moments, 2 police cars pulled up, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the park. Elijah stood still, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture, remembering his mother's lessons on how to interact with the police. He could feel the weight of the moment, knowing this could be the beginning of a very dangerous encounter. As the officers approached, they seemed more focused on Karen's accusations than on listening to Elijah. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his tone firm. Karen stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "This young man has been loitering here for hours. I'm concerned about the safety of the park." Elijah tried to explain, but the officer cut him off. "We'll get to you in a moment," he said dismissively. Elijah felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. His side of the story didn't seem to matter. But just as the tension reached its peak, a sleek black car pulled up to the park entrance. The door opened, and out stepped Elijah's mother, Mayor Vanessa Williams. Her presence immediately commanded attention, and both officers stiffened, recognizing her. The mood in the air shifted as the mayor approached her son, her face a mixture of concern and authority. "Why are you questioning my son?" Mayor Williams asked, her voice calm but unwavering. The officers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under her gaze. "He's just waiting for me," Elijah's mother continued, her protective hand resting on his shoulder. "And I think we all need to ask ourselves why he was seen as suspicious in the first place." The crowd fell silent as the mayor addressed the officers, her words cutting through the tension. This is a clear example of how racial bias influences our perceptions and actions. Every person, regardless of their race, deserves to exist peacefully in public spaces. We must do better. Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him as his mother stood up for him, but he also knew this moment would stay with him for a long time. The park that afternoon had been a place for reflection, but now it had become a catalyst for a much-needed conversation about race, bias, and justice. As his mother led him away from the scene, Elijah realized that their story was not just theirs, it was a story that needed to be heard by everyone. The sound of sirens grew louder as 2 police cruisers came to a halt in the park, their red and blue lights flashing across the trees. Elijah's heart raced as the officers stepped out, their eyes immediately locking onto him. The weight of their gaze made him feel smaller, as if his every move was being judged before a single word was spoken. Elijah had always known that situations like this could escalate quickly, especially for someone like him. His mother had taught him to remain calm and respectful when interacting with the police, but in this moment, all he could feel was a rising knot of anxiety in his stomach. He was still standing by the bench, his hands visible by his sides, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. He wanted to explain, to tell them the truth, that he was just waiting for his mother, but somehow, the words felt stuck in his throat. The taller officer walked up first, scanning Elijah's face as if trying to decide if he should be seen as a threat. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice flat, as if he had already decided that Elijah was guilty of something. Elijah took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "I've been here for a while. I'm not doing anything wrong." The second officer, who had been standing behind, didn't seem interested in Elijah's explanation. Instead, his gaze flicked over to Karen, the woman who had made the call, her words still hanging in the air, accusing Elijah of causing trouble. Without even acknowledging Elijah's side, the officer turned his focus entirely on Karen, listening intently as she repeated her version of the story. "He's been here for hours, just sitting there," Karen said, her tone dripping with suspicion. "I asked him to leave, but he wouldn't. He's been making me uncomfortable." The officers seemed more concerned with her accusations than with the fact that Elijah was, in fact, telling the truth. Their questions to him were sharp and curt, and their attention was split in a way that made Elijah feel invisible. He could feel the situation slipping away, the tension mounting as the officers dismissed his words and continued to probe, asking if he had any identification, as if his word alone wasn't enough to be trusted. "I don't have any ID with me," Elijah replied, his voice growing more uneasy. "I'm only 16. I don't carry a driver's license." His hands remained at his sides, a silent plea for them to understand. The officers exchanged glances, their judgment clear in the way they regarded him. Elijah knew that this moment, this interaction, could go down a very different path. The weight of racial bias, the assumptions people make based on skin color, was not lost on him. He was keenly aware that for a moment, his very presence was being questioned. As the questioning continued, it became clear that the officers had already made up their minds. Elijah was guilty of something, though they couldn't quite say what. The tension in the air thickened, and it seemed like they were more interested in maintaining control over the situation than actually listening to him. Elijah's anxiety mounted, and the park that had once seemed like a safe, peaceful place now felt suffocating. All he wanted was to go home, but it was clear that the road to getting there wasn't going to be easy. Just as Elijah felt the weight of the officer's judgment and the tension continued to rise, the unmistakable sound of a car engine cut through the air. A sleek black SUV pulled into the park, its tires screeching as it came to a halt near the gathering. Elijah's eyes flickered toward the vehicle, a wave of relief washing over him as he recognized the driver. His mother, Mayor Rachel Collins, had arrived. Her presence was immediate, commanding attention as she stepped out of the car, her posture straight, her gaze sharp. The officers, still fixated on Elijah, paused for a moment, their demeanor shifting. The commanding force in the air had changed. Elijah's heart began to race, not out of fear, but from the comfort of knowing his mother was there. She had always been a steady voice of reason, but more than that, she was a protector, a fierce advocate for what was right. As Mayor Collins walked toward the officers, her eyes locked onto them, her jaw set with quiet authority. "Why are you questioning my son?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The officers stiffened, momentarily thrown off guard. They hadn't anticipated this turn of events. The taller officer stammered slightly, struggling to explain himself. "Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious individual. We were just asking him a few questions." "A suspicious individual?" Mayor Collins echoed, her voice low but unwavering. "What exactly made him suspicious?" A young black teenager sitting quietly in a park waiting for his mother? The question hung in the air, as sharp as any accusation. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their previous confidence fading under the mayor's unflinching gaze. Elijah could see their uncertainty now, their position crumbling with each word his mother spoke. Do you realize how quickly these assumptions can escalate? Mayor Collins continued, her tone now both firm and disappointed. Do you understand the damage they cause, not just to my son, but to the community? The officers fell silent. Elijah could feel the shift, the change in the atmosphere. The tension began to melt, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet, as the gravity of the situation settled in. Elijah's mother wasn't just protecting him, she was challenging the very foundation of the bias that led to this moment. As she stood beside him, her presence like a shield, Elijah realized just how powerful it was when someone in a position of authority called out injustice. His mother wasn't just defending him, she was sending a message that would ripple far beyond this park. As Mayor Rachel Collins stood beside her son, Elijah, the tension in the park was palpable. The officers, who had once been so focused on their version of the story, now found themselves caught off guard. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with, and the revelation of Mayor Collins' identity hit them like a wave. The moment the mayor spoke, the officers' posture faltered, their certainty crumbling. The taller officer cleared his throat, his face flushed with the sudden realization that their assumptions had been deeply misguided. He glanced at his partner, both of them uncomfortable under the mayor's unwavering gaze. I didn't know, the officer mumbled, his voice trailing off. His words were laced with embarrassment, a recognition that they had made a serious mistake. They had acted on assumptions, not facts, and now they were facing the consequences. The crowd, which had gathered quietly in the background, began to murmur. They had witnessed the escalation, the unjust questioning, and now the truth was unfolding before them. Mayor Collins turned to face the onlookers, her expression calm but stern. This is the reality of racial bias, she said, her voice steady, yet full of conviction. It's the assumptions we make, often without even realizing it, that can harm someone's life. My son did nothing wrong, but he was treated as a suspect simply because of the color of his skin. This isn't just about one person, it's a systemic issue we all need to confront. The crowd grew still as the mayor's words sank in. There was a moment of collective reflection, as if everyone in the park was beginning to understand the gravity of what had just happened. The officers, now silent, seemed to acknowledge the weight of their error, and even Sarah, the woman who had called the police, stood awkwardly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I'm sorry, Sarah finally muttered, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I thought he was out of place. Her apology was small, but it carried the weight of someone who had realized the harm they had caused. Mayor Collins nodded, acknowledging her words without anger, but with the clear message that apologies alone weren't enough. This situation highlights a critical need for change, Mayor Collins continued, her gaze now sweeping over the crowd. We must all examine our biases, challenge our assumptions, and work together to ensure that everyone in our community feels safe and valued. The officers stood quietly, their eyes cast downward. They had been forced to confront not just their own biases, but the wider problem that plagued society. The moment of realization was uncomfortable, but necessary. As the mayor guided Elijah away from the scene, her words lingered in the air. It wasn't just a lesson for the officers or for Sarah, it was a lesson for everyone present. A reminder that the fight for justice and equality required more than just acknowledgement, it required action. And it had to start with each one of them. The incident in Oakwood Park quickly became the spark that ignited a much-needed conversation about racial profiling in their community. Mayor Rachel Collins, determined to address the deep-seated biases that had been exposed, took immediate action. The tension in the air lingered, but the mayor's calm, resolute voice brought focus to the problem. As she addressed the crowd, her words were both a call to action and a promise of change. "We cannot ignore the reality of racial profiling any longer," Mayor Collins began, her tone firm but compassionate. "This incident, though uncomfortable, has shown us just how pervasive these biases are, how quickly assumptions are made based on race. This is not just about one unfortunate situation, it's about creating a community where every person, regardless of the color of their skin, feels safe and valued." Her words resonated deeply with many in the crowd, who had watched the injustice unfold before them. Some nodded in agreement, while others, unsure at first, began to see the importance of confronting this issue head-on. The mayor's commitment was clear, and her announcement was even more so. "I am calling for the immediate implementation of anti-bias training for our police force and all city employees," Mayor Collins declared, her voice carrying across the park. "This training will help us recognize our own biases, challenge harmful assumptions, and, most importantly, prevent situations like this from ever happening again." Despite the mayor's determination, the announcement was met with mixed reactions. A few in the crowd exchanged skeptical glances, unsure if such training would truly make a difference. Some voiced concerns about whether the changes would stick, whether the city could truly change its ways. But Mayor Collins stood firm, addressing their concerns with grace. "Change is never easy," she said, her gaze steady. "But it is necessary. Anti-bias training is only a first step, but it's a crucial one. It's about creating a culture of understanding, empathy, and respect for everyone in our community." In the days that followed, the conversation about racial bias spread beyond Oakwood Park. Local newspapers picked up the story, and community leaders began organizing town hall meetings to discuss ways to combat racial profiling. Some businesses in the area put up signs promoting inclusivity, and the police department began engaging more with the community, seeking to rebuild trust. Yet, not everyone was convinced that change would come easily. There were whispers of doubt, questions about whether the system could truly be reformed. But Mayor Collins remained resolute, reminding the community that real change starts with each individual. This moment in the park had shown that complacency could no longer be an option. As the weeks passed, small shifts began to take place. Officers participated in more community outreach, and the city began to confront uncomfortable truths about racial bias. While the journey ahead was long, the impact of that day in the park was undeniable. It had forced the community to look inward, to examine their own biases, and to start the difficult but necessary work of creating a more just society for everyone. And the weeks that followed the incident at Oakwood Park, the ripple effects were felt throughout the community. Mayor Rachel Collins had sparked a conversation that was impossible to ignore. The conversation about racial bias, about how assumptions based on race could shape an entire community's perception, was no longer confined to the park. It had spread through dinner tables, offices, and schools. The realization that racial profiling was not just a rare occurrence, but a deeply rooted issue, began to settle in. People who had once dismissed the idea of bias now found themselves questioning their own assumptions. Local organizations, schools, and even small businesses began to engage in conversations about inclusivity. Town halls were held, and community leaders stepped up, ready to confront uncomfortable truths that had long been ignored. At the forefront of this movement was Mayor Collins, who remained steadfast in her commitment to change. She understood that the work wasn't going to be easy or quick, but she also knew that every small step was part of a larger journey toward justice. The mayor announced additional outreach programs, aimed at strengthening community-police relations and promoting diversity within local institutions. She also pushed for deeper engagement with young people, encouraging them to participate in these difficult conversations. "We must be the change we wish to see," Mayor Collins often said, her words a reminder that lasting transformation comes from within. The community had been shaken, but it was also being given the chance to rebuild, to grow, and to heal. As the months passed, visible changes began to take shape. More officers attended community outreach events, taking the time to listen, to understand. Local businesses began displaying signs of support for racial equality, and the school district implemented diversity programs aimed at raising awareness and fostering unity among young students. Yet, despite these efforts, the journey was far from over. The road to change required patience, perseverance, and a commitment to confronting biases that ran deep within the fabric of society. The community was learning, but it was clear that there was more work to be done. This is where you come in. The conversation cannot end here. We all have a role to play in confronting racial injustice and fostering inclusivity. What are you doing to challenge your own assumptions? How can we, together, continue this journey toward a more just society? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.